screen okay? Yep, awesome. Okay, so today's April 15th. We're going to go through an orientation of the budget. And here's the agenda. So I want to start with introducing the who. So it's you lovely folks who have volunteered. And I just want to start by saying thank you so much for your time, for getting to know our budget and helping putting your brains and your expertise to making sure the budget's in the right place and that we're moving it forward in the best way possible. We're going to go through the purpose of the committee, the purpose of the process, the why we're doing it. I know a lot of you have experience with boards before, but since we're putting this out into the public and just to cover everything, I'm going to walk through the why and why we're doing what we do and based on Oregon budget law. We'll also talk about the budget development process, both internally and externally. We'll talk a little bit about the overview of higher education in Oregon and where the Lane Community Colleges lands with comparison to other colleges. We'll talk a little bit about our planning components, the levels of planning that we have in our budget. We'll also talk about I'll give you an orientation of where we're at year to date, more or less, for the current fiscal year. And then also some very high level planning assumptions on how we developed our proposal for FY25. And then we'll go over next steps and we'll leave enough room at the end for conversation. But like I said, feel free to stop me at any point with questions, clarifications you want to throw out there. So with that, we'll dive right in. So these are your budget committee members, our budget committee members. You should be on this table anyways. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to just do a round of introductions. I don't know if everyone's met yet. Some committee members couldn't make this afternoon session. They attended an earlier session today, so we'll all meet together on May 1st as a group to start talking about everything for the budget. Like I said, my name is Jonathan. I've been at Lane Community College in this role for about 6 months, so I'm still learning a lot of it too, but I have over 10 years of experience with higher education. I worked at U of O for about 9 years in budget, grants administration, and so on with finance. I also did a quick stop for about a year as a consultant with a software company that does budget implementation. So I got to see about 12 or 13 different institutions across the country of different sizes to see the different flavors of chaos that higher education institutions have. So I'm pretty familiar with it. And so I'm going to start with, I'm going to let Kara introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Kara Plath, Vice President of Finance and Operations. Just started a couple weeks ago, so excited to be here, and thank you for being willing to be on this committee, and big thank you to Jonathan for doing this training.
Thanks, Kara. And then I have Larissa at my top left. We'll start with you.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. Thank you. It's nice to be here. I'm pleased to meet everyone. My name is Larissa Ennis. I use she, her pronouns. I was just appointed to this committee last week, I think, and so this is a very new thing in my world. But I have quite a bit of experience with higher education administration, budget management, etc. During my current day job, I'm the Director of Community Relations and Sponsorships for University of Oregon. I've worked at University of Oregon for a little over 15.5 years as a full-time staff member and got my master's and PhD there before that. So been there for a long, long time. The nonprofits that I've served on the boards of have been quite small, like 2 FTE, all the way up to, I'm currently on the board of Homes for Good, Lane County's affordable housing agency. So just a big mix and a big range. And you didn't ask for this, but a fun fact about myself, I have 3 very small dogs. So you might see my door kind of opening for no reason. It's not ghosts, it's dogs.
Yes. They want to help us with the budget too. Thank you so much for joining, especially at the last minute. We really appreciate you. All right, we'll go with Charlie next.
Sorry about that. I get unmuted. I'm Charlie Kimball. Currently, I work for Murphy Company as Senior Vice President, Finance, CFO, kind of also. We're we're transitioning, doing a little expansion here at the company. My background is, I came up through public accounting back when there was still Coopers and Lybrand before it became PricewaterhouseCoopers. Fun fact for me, I did my first year of education, higher education at LCC back in 1984. Met my wife there of now 38 years. We have two daughters, grown daughters with families here in town. And I did my undergrad at Linfield, and Linfield had a lot of satellite campus programs through LCC back in the day. And then recently completed my MBA recently. It doesn't seem that long ago, 2009, completed my MBA with Willamette University.
So thank you so much for joining us. I have Ron next. Ron, can you hear us okay? All right, well, if he's able to come back and unmute, we'll come back for an introduction from him, or we'll catch him next time if maybe the audio is not working. So last but not least, we have John Nisbet also on the line. I'll let him introduce himself.
Sure, can you hear me?
Okay.
Well, so I'm the interim vice president of finance and operations. I've been on board for about 6 months until we transitioned, well, currently with Kara getting on board with us here in March. So been helping throughout the budget process and been great. So nice to meet you all. I trying to hunt for my video settings. Unfortunately, I don't know if I joined by webinar or whatever my settings are, but my camera doesn't function the way I'm set up. So anyhow, nice to meet you all.
You can pop your face on later and just wave as we're going through it. Whatever. All right, so thank you again for your time.
Here we are.
All right.
Thanks.
Thanks everybody for introductions. So we'll all get together on May 1st. We'll see each other in person or on Zoom. I can't remember if we're all on Zoom or in person, but we'll get the whole team together May 1st to meet for the first time as a group. So we'll have more introductions then. All right. So we're going to talk a little bit about the why, right? So the purpose of the committee is basically to put your collective brains as part of the public to review the budget, to review our internal proposal, what we've put together and developed as through our internal processes to review the budget, officially receive it, and to provide opportunity to hear public comment. So during the meetings in May, we'll also have available options for public comment from whoever wants to come review and hear what we have to say. So your role is to hear all the things, review all the things, and get to know Lane Community College, get to know our budget, and help us validate our assumptions, to validate where we're going, and make sure that we're putting the best possible budget forward. You can make proposals as a committee to reduce or increase the estimates of what we're seeing and change our assumptions as you go through it. If something just doesn't look right, and talk through it and you want to change that and make a recommendation to make those changes, you can do that. You'll also officially approve it. And so the committee, the budget committee also includes the Board of Education. So our 7 members that sit on the board, they're a part of the committee too, and they'll officially review it with us. And you'll work hand in hand with our board members to review it, to take a stab at it, to kind of pick it apart. My feelings won't get hurt if you go through and you just see something that doesn't look right. The whole idea is to get input from everybody to make sure we're doing the right thing for the college. So this is the moment where I say this is the orientation meeting. So I can't talk about the budget, the next year's budget proposal yet. It's we're not officially in that process, but the idea for this committee at this point is for me to give you an orientation to the college, to give you a foundation to review the budget proposal. So when we walk in the door, you kind of already know what the context is, what the story is, and what's happening behind it. So that's what we're doing here for the next hour and a half. So, Oregon budget law has been around for a long time, and there's a couple of different reasons that it is set up. and Department of Revenue, who are the owners of the Oregon budget law, come up with a really good training every year for budget officers like myself. And they have a full PowerPoint that I've linked in this presentation, which I'll send to you afterwards. But they go through what the purpose of the process is and what the purpose of the committee is. So I highlighted it here and summarized it to go through it because it's pretty good. And it takes their 200, 300 page Oregon budget law and condenses it down of the question of why into this. So we could all come up with our own frameworks and budget proposals from each college and have our own budget process and our own framework. But at the end of the day, we're working with legislation, our partners and folks up in Salem, to give them information on how to best fund higher education in Oregon, right? So up until a certain point, all the colleges were doing it a certain different way. So they would get different budget proposals and would not quite be apples to apples, and it was hard to get a real grasp on what the landscape was for higher education. So they came up with the Oregon budget law to give everyone a framework, a process, and a standard by which to create the budget and to give it some apples to apples comparison. And that's what this first bullet is at. It's just standardizing the process and the procedure. The second part and the main part is to encourage citizen involvement, such as yourselves. Like I said, we want to get everyone involved in the community because we are a community institution that services and engages and collaborates with different folks and different teams and stakeholders in the community to help create a better place for our Lane County community, right? So we want everybody to get involved. So that's why you're here, is to lend your expertise to developing that budget. It also provides a framework for creating proper estimates. So there's so many different granular variables that go into our operations. We have different revenue streams from tuitions, property tax, with different variables that we can plug in for salary costs, for capital projects, and so on. So it gives us a framework and another method, a standardized method that we can come up with those calculations to kind of do that apples to apples comparison. It also gives us a method for control. So not just doing this one-time plan it and done kind of situation, but budgeting and finance is an ongoing day-to-day. It evolves every day. We liked to joke during the internal process that we would formulate a framework and come up with a presentation for everybody, and then the next day it would literally change. We would have to change something and talk about how this is a point in time, a snapshot. So it gives us, Oregon budget law gives us kind of that method to the madness of how we plan, how we develop our budgets, and not only plan them, but also manage them from a day-to-day perspective. And then I put, they summarize it to encourage citizen involvement again, because that's so important. And I inserted a little exclamation point there because that's so crucial. It gives the public an opportunity, a window into what John and Kara and I do every day, an opportunity to provide input and see what we do and how we do it, and to help us make sure that our heads are on straight, basically, to keep moving in the right direction every day. So that's the how and the why. And so we talked about when. So this is the, I'm going to use air quotes for the 10 easy steps to create a budget law, right? So there's 10 steps supposedly, but there's more than 10 steps on the screen here. So you can see as we move through, there's requirements and timing of things that we have to make sure that we're adhering to as we move through the process. And I like to point this one out. In another presentation, I did the "you are here" method, where you walk into a building and you're trying to see where you're going in the building. It says "you are here." The arrow would point to about right here between steps 2 and 3. So we've been working on our budget since November, and you can see that we have the rest of this process to fit in before June 30th and July 15th. So it's still a lot of work to be done, but I feel really good about the process we've made. We've had a lot of collaboration, and I'm looking forward to having you all put your eyes and ears and brains into the budget we've developed so far. Any questions about Oregon budget law, what I've talked about so far? Clear as mud, straightforward. Okay. So that's Oregon budget law in a nutshell. I've linked some other resources on the resources tab down below, so you can, if you choose to have your nighttime reading be Oregon budget law, you can go read it before you go to bed, kind of thing. So if you have more questions, you can also reach out to us. I've included our contact information down below. So down into more of a, how are things laid out? What's the lay of the land? I'm going to talk a little bit about LCC's financial structure, talk a little bit about what the composite is of our revenues and expenses and how we plan. So talking about resources first, this is a pie chart of what our revenue stream looks like. You can see the biggest three parts are state support. It's about 34%. That's what we get from the state. And in the budget proposal, you'll see a formula of how that's created, how they determine how much funding we get for higher education to our specific college. There's a whole method to the madness, which I can't claim that I understand every little bit of it. But the Higher Education Commission has a whole team that does this year round that decides how higher education is funded in Oregon. And that's what this state support is all about. The second biggest piece is related to property tax. So Lane County and its surrounding counties, such as Benton County, we get a piece of property taxes to help fund higher education. It is also based on Oregon budget law. There's a cap at how much property taxes can increase, how much we give them value, and how much we get back from that. And so that is a predictable revenue stream. We know more or less, I mean, there's always changes in the real estate market, but we know more or less that it's going to come in at a certain amount within a ballpark. Tuition is the next biggest piece, and this is really the only lever that we have direct control over because it's based on our institution. It is heavily dependent on enrollment. It depends on how much our operational costs and what gap there is between state funding and property taxes and our operational costs. We'll talk a little bit more about that later and how we think about it from a formula perspective. But just for reference, you'll have seen that the board approved a 4% increase to tuition in the next coming year. So that's public knowledge, right? So I can talk about those kind of high level assumptions and those factors going into our budget. So that brings the total tuition cost at $145 per enrollment credit. And that's how we think about it. So it's how many credits is a student enrolling and what's the one-to-one ratio of how much that revenue generates per person, per student. And then we have this other bucket. And so this is everything else that we get that's not in these three main revenue streams. It's things like overhead that we get from grants, or if we get a federal tax credit, something like that. That falls into this bucket where it comes in the door and we slice it in a couple of different ways and it has different requirements around it. So generally speaking, this is our pie. This is our all of our revenue streams in one place. This is our famous dollar graphic. I don't know if you have seen the prior budget documents from prior years. I've linked FY24, so the current year's budget document, and this is a graphic that we've handed down from generation to generation of budget officers. This is based on FY22's actuals, but it stays more or less the same from year to year unless there's drastic changes. And what I mean by that is you can see that about half goes to instruction. So the student experience in the classroom, how we support our faculty to teach a class, how we put effort into making sure that the student gets the best education when they come to Lane. Almost half of our tuition dollars that we get in the door, we plug right back into instruction. I'll skip over here to this 7 cents because this supports instruction. This is what we put into the infrastructure of the classroom as an example. So classroom technology, materials and supplies, what the student experiences outside of the direct one-to-one or the relationship between the faculty and the student. We also have the student services, which is 11 cents. Those are things like mental and health care for the students. We have childcare services that are available to the student on campus. It basically goes into augmenting and promoting the accessibility of students to our campus and to instruction. Then the other parts, we have college support services. So that's services like myself, budget, college finance, payroll, administration of the college. 22 cents, a little bit less than a quarter goes into supporting the day-to-day operations. Plant operations and maintenance, that's basically facilities, the physical structure of the campuses itself, the buildings, the maintenance, the repairs, all of that. We spend about 7 cents per dollar. And then we have other stuff. You can dig down, you could go as deep as you want down into the rabbit hole of how we spend the tuition dollar, but we have about 2 cents that's hard to categorize into the big buckets. So when we think about our budget and we think about what the total composite is of all of our expenditures, about 84% of it is personnel cost. So when we're planning, the biggest impact to the budget is going to be anything that's related to salary costs, personnel costs. That's going to be the biggest splash. So things like labor bargaining unit agreements, if we have changes to staff, we have an increase in vacancies of positions. That has the biggest splash because it's the biggest piece by a long shot of our budget. It is pretty comparable to other institutions. Most institutions run somewhere between 75 and 85% of their total budget is related to personnel. So then with the rest of the pie is operational, tangible stuff that's non-payroll. Travel, contracts, office supplies, and so on. And y'all feel free to stop me at any time because I'm just going. If you have questions, let me know. Otherwise, I'm going to flood you with information. Okay, so that's the general makeup of LCC from the financial structure point of view. When we talk about planning, so planning levels, planning components, planning dimensions, we think of it more or less in 4 different levels. And this can tie back to this is how most institutions do it as a best practice. There's variations on it. There's different ways you can do it. There's no right or wrong. But when we think about it, we start with our major fund categories or our primary funds. So these, by Oregon budget law, are the primary funds we have to have in order to account for all the expenditures, all the revenue, everything that comes into the daily operations. We start with our general funds. When you take out the bonds, which is roughly 100 to 250 million, I can't remember the exact amount. When you take out the bonds, general funds is about 80 to 90% of the total budget. So it's the biggest part. It's the main driver, and it interacts with all of the other funds that we have through transfers, ins and outs. So we have all the state revenue comes here, property taxes, all main expenditures that have to do with day-to-day operations. They all land in the general fund. So that's why it's called our primary operations. It's our main driver. This fund 2 is internal services. It's institutional wide services for the institution itself. So it's things like the motor pool, warehouse services, printing and graphics. It's services that cover the whole institution. So they live on their own fund. So that way we can call them out as kind of this, they cross the whole organization. Funds 3 and 4 relate really closely because it's debt service. So it's things like bonds. It's where we carry our debt for property. It's where we pay for all of our debt that comes in the door. But sometimes we pay for those things with bond money. So for example, Fund 4 is capital projects. That's where we plop most of our bond 2020 funds. They go in here to help us build a new iTech building. We have a new health building being built on campus. We resurfaced the track. It looks a really nice track and field. All of those big capital projects come in the door through Fund 4, but we pay for the debt off of Fund 3. So I'm going to jump over to Fund 6, which is enterprise, because it also relates to Funds 3 and 4. Fund 6 is enterprise, which are things like student housing, so Titan Court downtown, and also things like the bookstore. So not necessarily internal services, and there's kind of a gray area there, but we put things like Titan Court in Fund 6 because it's a big enterprise operation. As a physical space, we use it for student housing. They pay a lease. So students pay a little bit of revenue. It comes into Fund 6. We use that lease revenue to turn around and pay the debt service on Fund 3. Fund 5 is financial aid. By law, we have to pull apart financial aid because it's technically revenue that comes in to support students. It's kind of a pass-through, so we pull that out into its own big fund. It's student support, student service because it's money for them. Fund 7 is that's primary things like PERS expense. If we have early retirement for faculty, we pay for their retirement expense from there. We have to pull that apart because it's accounted for in a different way than if we put it on the general fund. It's not technically healthcare. It's not something like Medicare or Social Security. It's its own bucket of money that Oregon requires us to pull apart. Okay, so funds 8 and 9 operate in a slightly different way than the other funds in that think of them as many businesses or many programs within that big fund. So grants and contracts, for example, if you get a grant, it's for a specific purpose. So you have to account for it and separately from everything else. Typically, they also fall on a different calendar cycle, so they might not follow the July to June calendar that we consider a fiscal year. So each sub-fund within Fund 8 is its own grant. It's its own project. Same thing with Fund 9. These are programs like KLCC, the Flight Academy, international programs, because they get such specific types of funding, their revenue streams and the things they have to pay for are very unique. So for example, the Flight Academy, out of the Eugene Airport, they fly all the time, all weather. So we have to pay specific fees to keep for the tower to be able to fly in and out of. They have aviation fees that the students pay for. So right now, at this time, they live on Fund 9. They're their own program within Fund 9. They can't borrow from international programs. They can't share expenses or revenue because they're accounted for. So when we talk about Funds 8 and 9, the ending fund balance, for example, we see it as a whole ending fund balance, but we really have to dive down into what the ending fund balance is for each individual program to get a true sense of what's happening with each of those programs. Does that make sense so far? I just kind of put it out there, but.
Yes.
Okay, great. So on page 50 of the current budget document, there's a really nice graph that breaks down what each fund has in it. And I welcome you to open up that document and look through what's in there, but there is a nice representation of the major funds. So moving on to the second planning dimension, I feel like I've been talking about planning components for a long time already, but there is a lot of things that go into how we plan. The second one are primary organizational units, right? So this is essentially how we live our day-to-day life. You think about academic affairs, that's everything related to the faculty, curriculum development, and then within academic affairs, we have academic disciplines or different areas or programs that include areas like health professions, arts and humanities, the dance program. They all roll up in general to the academic affairs top level organizational unit. So we have this org chart that kind of flows up and down, but this is the how we think of our expenses and our operations from day to day. I won't read through all of these because there's a pretty good description and I think they're self-explanatory, but just know that this is one of our planning dimensions. So we go from fund, and each fund is allocated out to an org or an organizational unit. So we get $100,000 from state, we break it out, we give half to academic affairs, we give half to college finance. That's an example of how we would do that allocation. Okay, so then this one's a little bit tricky. Not tricky, but programmatic areas. This is how we report our budget and track our budget to the state, to government officials when we need to talk about what we're doing as an institution. Currently and historically, we have broken it out into these different programmatic areas. And we do that because activity can cross both organizational unit and also a fund. So think about, for example, a student comes in the door, they take a class that's in academic affairs, but then they also have student services that they tap into. So we categorize the activity and how we allocate our budget by programmatic area. And what that does is it gives us a nice, clean kind of snapshot of a specific activity across other planning dimensions, other planning levels, to help us explain what we do as an institution. It also gives us flexibility we track, for example, the budget authority allocated to instruction crosses different organizations. And so instead of worrying about capping out how much money we give to, say, for example, health professions, it's not exactly tracked that way when we talk about budget authority. We instead track it as a whole within these higher level programmatic areas. So it gives us a little more flexibility in how we can move our budget around and operationally from a day-to-day perspective. Does that make sense? That layer kind of adds a little complexity to it. I just want to make sure that that's clear, because when you get the budget proposal for FY25, you'll see more allocations based on programmatic area than you will anything else, because that's how we talk to the state agency, basically. Yeah, go ahead, Lou.
I think I pretty much understand this. Can you give an example of what would fall under community services?
Yeah, so that would be fundraising, KLCC. That would be something that is outwardly facing. So we do public engagement, kind of like that. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, any other questions about programmatic areas? I'll keep moving, but I'm happy to answer questions later on too. Okay, so the fourth planning level is your straight up just standard accounting principles, your accounting roll-up categories. So when we look at our day-to-day expenses and revenues, these are the high level buckets by which we capture those transactions. We get things like state funding and tuition versus salary and benefits expense. We can go as granular as saying, how much is Medicare cost, right? We can drill down that far into the details to help us plan. But really, when we're talking about planning from a higher level institutional, the whole campus, these are the levels that we look at and plan. This makes sense to people. This is what people will read, knowing that there's a deeper level for us to plan by. So it's just all of your basic accounting categories that you see in an institution, and they work with each other. All right, so that's the Oregon budget law. That's the composition of our institution, and that's how we plan, more or less. From there, I'm going to take a step back and I'm going to gear up into talking about the part of the story where we kind of validate people's feelings of what people are feeling is happening with higher education, because it does have an impact on how we plan and how we forecast, how we set up our institution for success in the long run. So when we talk about higher education currently, we all know that enrollment took a huge hit during COVID. Students didn't want to, weren't able to, for one reason or another, to go to school. They weren't afforded the best opportunity. And so when you Google enrollment in community colleges right now, these are some of the highlights you get, right? So these are fairly recent. And I love this because it talks about what we're all feeling, what we see in the data. Enrollment is improving, but, right? I liked this. This was the snippet I got when I Googled higher education enrollment. And I included the link here because it does go into the depths of why we're still being conservative about enrollment rebound at community colleges, because we have seen an uptick. And there's a lot of different reasons why we're still conservative about forecasting enrollment in community colleges, higher ed in general. So I'll let you all read through that, because it is interesting, and it talks about things like why a student might start, why they might stop, why they might not even start to begin with, and kind of what the new generation of college students, what the demographics look like. It goes into the finest details of enrollment projections. So we do take that into consideration when we plan our budget, but there's a few key elements that we really consider for that are more standard metrics. And so one of them is called the HEPI. Who of you, has anyone heard of the HEPI before? No? Okay. So the HEPI, it stands for Higher Education Price Index. And it's been around for a long time, but I will say that in recent years that it has become more and more a part of the public consciousness in determining how much it costs for a student to go to school, what their return is on paying that money to get an education, but also how much it costs for an institution to run their operation and fulfill their mission. So it has this really in-depth formula. It has a lot of data behind it. It looks at higher education as a whole. So it takes data from across the country. It's a national standard, and it's a metric that we look at because you'll see on the screen, it more or less follows the CPI, or the Consumer Price Index, as looking at the cost of things, but it is slightly different. So the orange is inflation. It's the cost of things going up and down over time, or the change of, but also the blue is our HEPI. So that's the cost of higher education as a whole. And so when we start thinking about, I mentioned tuition is one of our only levers that we have direct control over. When we're setting tuition rates to generate revenue to be able to run our day-to-day operations, to do our business, a part of it is based on making sure that we're not completely out of scope with how we set tuition. And this is one of the metrics that we use to help us guide that principle. So we look heavily at the HEPI to help set tuition rates and to help guide the board on approving tuition. So there is, I'm not sure if I included it here, but there are links to the HEPI that talk about the HEPI that go into all the details. But just know that the HEPI follows the CPI. It went up drastically since COVID because of supply chain issues, force majeure. There's things like wars that kind of create supply chain issues. Staffing is the thing that we're always looking at. So all these additional costs that add up to increase costs for higher education across the board. I just wanted to point that out as a metric that we use when we're doing forecasting and budgeting. The other consideration is, so we filter down one more level to not just the nationwide landscape, but the landscape within Oregon itself. How do we compare with the other 17 colleges in Oregon? So there's 17 community colleges. We look closely at what our tuition rates are in comparison to everyone else. That's especially exacerbated by the DOM and the rise of online enrollment, online courses. Students are very sensitive to tuition, even more so these days, because you can get online, enroll for an online class at pretty much any nationwide community college these days, depending on what you want to take. Doesn't necessarily give you the same experience, but that is a factor that we look at. And so I'll send these slides out afterwards. You can see Lane Community College here in the middle. Green is our charge, our tuition, so that $145 that we're going to see next year. Actually, this is $139. So that's based on this year's tuition. You can see our tuition is one of the highest. At any given point, we kind of go back and forth with 3 or 4 other colleges in Oregon of how we compare with tuition costs. But when you roll in factoring in tuition plus fees, so student fees, mandatory fees, all the course fees that the student pays for taking a class, we're a little bit lower than everybody else. So you have to really look at the creative formula for, as a whole, how we compare to other colleges for the total cost. And that's what this chart is getting at. So a little more context, a little more landscaping before I get into the year-to-date update in the budget. Something else that we look at too is state funding. Like I said, there's a whole formula that goes into how much funding we get from the state. We think about it as how much of the pie do we get? And you can see from about FY19 on, our portion of the pie has been flat. we get about 8% of the total pie year over year. That seems to be a standard. We've kind of leveled out with enrollment and all the other components that go into it. So unless Salem decides that the pie is going to get bigger, we get about the same amount of money for higher education as a percentage of the whole. However, you can see that because our operating costs have gone up, we've had to increase revenue in other areas such as tuition to accommodate the gap between what we get from the state, property taxes, and what our actual operating costs are. So we've had to gradually increase tuition, increase overhead, our F&A rates, and so on over time to get to this projected mark right here. So that's when we shifting into, we're in the second year of a budget biennium with the state. So we know what our tuition, we know what our state revenue is going to be for this year, but next year, they're already planning for how much money is allocated from the legislation for higher education as a whole. So we already have begun the process of informing the Higher Education Commission and our legislators what our needs are, where we currently stand, what our projections are, and this kind of graphic gets at how we talk with our representatives and our stakeholders about how important education funding is. Okay. Any questions about higher education as a whole? I could probably talk for like hours about education as a whole, but yeah.
It looked like for the higher education price index, I'm assuming that that doesn't account for differences between 2- and 4-year private public. That's just kind of everyone into one big pot as a
Right.
percentage.
Correct. Yep. And there are breakdowns of what the different institution types are, but as a whole, we think about what they all are put together. All right. So adding more layers. The FY24 planning and management of the budget. So we started this year in kind of an uncertain spot. We had an uptick in enrollments last February. That was the first point at which we saw that there was a rebound in enrollment, but there was not enough data to validate that enrollment would continue to increase when we were setting last year's budget. So we set an ultra conservative budget coming into FY24, and there were some things that we just didn't know yet. So, but now we look back in time and we see that enrollment has continued to increase. So that has generated about a $373,000, $100,000 increase to our revenue stream. We have about once or twice a year, the Higher Education Commission does an analysis and a reconciliation, and they can either give you money or take money depending on where the resources land. So this year they actually gave us 1.35 additional revenue above. And because we didn't know where things were at, we went through a budget balancing exercise in the spring and the fall of last calendar year. That's where we needed to make decisions.
This is wrong. If you get the message, give me a call.
So we went into the planning year saying that we knew we needed to balance the budget. So what we did was we reduced operating supplies, non-salary, by a certain amount, service level reductions in programming and whatnot by a little amount across the board. We also froze current positions for hiring. So we had a certain, it was about 1.6 million in positions that were frozen. And we validated that enrollment continued to get better, we have started to release some of those positions. And in FY25, those positions have been approved to be filled as needed by what is needed by the college. So meaning that specific positions might not be refilled as is because they've been sitting out there for a while, but we've done a needs assessment on what the college needs. We also started the year with a $4 million reserve for revenue shortfall, meaning that we thought enrollment would come in better than anticipated, but in case it didn't, we set aside $4 million to cover that shortfall in case. So as enrollment has continued to improve, we've released some of that revenue back into the general fund to accommodate enrollment growth, activities across campus, things like part-time instructor positions and so on. But remember the but, we talked about this, enrollment is improving, but we still are being conservative about the outlook. So we know that we have structural deficits in the out years of planning. So in the long range planning, we know that a lot depends on where state funding comes in. So if we get a certain amount of state funding, things look good, but if it's less than that, then we need to figure out ways to make up that gap. So we're continuing to, we've developed a framework for forecasting. We have a model that gives us kind of a 3-year outlook and so on. But Charlie has a question, go ahead.
So we talk about $4 million reserve for revenue shortfall, and that's approved out of some sort of a fund. Is that correct? What does that really do?
So
Where do those funds
basically,
come from?
yeah, so it's more about budget authority. So when we set our budget, we're trying to determine what we think our budget, our resources are going to be. So when we talked about tuition and state funding, we set up a certain amount for revenue, saying that we think we're going to hit here, we'll say about $30 million. But we're not going to budget all of that in the general funds or on the major funds. We're going to set it up in a reserve, kind of like, we're not going to put them in a specific expense, but we want it to balance against what our revenue is. So it's essentially just a $4 million bucket sitting on the expense side of the accounting balance. Just saying, if we have increased activity, we'll move, well, if we do get that 4 million, we'll move it into the general funds to support those expenditures. Does that make sense? Did I answer your question?
Yeah, it's kind of like a contingency. So if you have it to spend, you've got it earmarked, so you've got available. So it doesn't really speak to what the actual, this isn't projecting what the actual revenue shortfall is. This is your ability to have some budgeting maneuverability.
Exactly.
Gotcha.
Yep. You said it better than I did. So thank you. Okay. Good question. Okay, so we presented a Q2 analysis, a year-to-date analysis back in January, February. I think it was early February, and we're working on the third quarter analysis. We just closed the books on the third quarter finally, so we're up to date more or less. But this trajectory that you're seeing on the top right, when we talk about burn rate, utilization, we talk about how much of our money that we're spending, how much of our budget that we're spending, it's tracking more or less to historical average. So what we're saying is that we have increased activity. We validate that feeling by everybody across campus with the numbers, more students, more revenue, but that means we have higher costs to do that business, right? So every time we get a revenue dollar in, that means we have another student that's sitting in a classroom that we're supporting. So there's an additional cost. So just because there's additional revenue doesn't mean that we're seeing a net on that revenue, which means that we're burning, and you can see this blue line here. This is 2024, and so far I don't have it updated, but this is more or less still tracking. We're just burning a little bit higher than we normally do, but not with cause of concern. There are some things that we're tracking going into the last month or two of this year. So things like positions and vacancies. Our spring and summer enrollment looked pretty good. So we're still tracking at that 4 to 5% of enrollment growth year over year. So we might actually end up looking really good for this year. We'll also track other big, large one-time expenses that don't hit with a regular cadence. They don't come in at the same time as years past. So things like additional maintenance costs, deferred maintenance. Sometimes we have insurance that hits later than it does, but all in all, I think we're still tracking pretty well. So an update on enrollments. So you can see here that this kind of gives a breakout where it's the picture in the story. You can see we've got this decline in enrollment over the last 10 years. And then right about here in that February of last year mark, we start seeing an uptick. So in FY24, the trend line continues to go up, where we have about a 4 to 5% enrollment growth year over year. We're not sure if that is going to continue to rebound or if that's going to kind of flatline against what our pre-COVID standards were. But the picture and what we're seeing in the data now is that enrollment still is kind of on the moderate uptick, that's good. We're not in this slide that we've seen over the last 10 years. So moving into FY25 budget planning. So we have worked closely with, I have labeled them budget partners over the last 5 to 6 months, getting input from everybody. And well, before I get there, we have high-level guiding principles that help us set our budget. These are our strategic initiative, our strategic plan, which I've linked here. It's a big document with a lot of goals, and so you can click here and see what it is, but it's mostly all the things you would expect related to student success, access, equity, and inclusion, making sure that we're sustainable moving into the future years, all the good stuff that should go into a strategic plan. We tie back to it directly when we set our budget. LCC is a public institution, so we are fund accounting 101. We account for every penny that is spent or that comes in the door, we track it. So making sure that it's responsible use of taxpayer dollars and tuition dollars. We want to reflect the current economic environment, all the feelings that we've talked about, the charts with higher ed across the nation in Oregon, make sure we're not out of scope there. And then also make sure that we're living within our means, if you will. So we're not greatly exceeding what our revenue streams are, our resources available. We're not tapping out before we get money in the door. And then, of course, our FY24 adopted budget. This is our playbook. This is what we use to help us guide. I have a copy of it. When I have questions about how we're set up, I pull it open and try to read through it and see where things should be, where they should be tracked, and how they're set up. So we talked a little bit about the Oregon budget law process in the calendar, but we also have an internal process for about 5 to 6 months out of the year. We're planning, and it doesn't stop there. It keeps going. But this is our internal calendar that we set back in November, December. You can see we're in April. We're about to gear up to turn outward facing and meet with you all, meet with the public, and hear public comment. I just want to give a shout out to all the people that have provided input. We've worked closely with all of the governance components of the college. We have a budget development subcommittee that's a representative group of all the different employee groups, so classified, faculty. It has student representatives on there that give us input on how changes to the budget would impact the students. So it's been a really informative couple of sessions for us to figure out how to set up our budget. We get input from the deans and directors directly, so we give them a template. They give us feedback on where they think their program is going from a programmatic level. So they get templates, they plug in their numbers, and they feed them back to us as almost their internal proposal process, and we try to smash it all together and make sure that it fits. Of course, we work with their program coordinators, their budget coordinators, the folks who do the transactions every day, and so on. We also work with our leaders, the cabinet, the board of educators to get guidance and input. So it's been feel like we've been doing this for a really long time, but everyone's been very collaborative in giving us budget information. So. Okay, so what I'm about to present, these next couple of slides, are high-level assumptions. This is all public knowledge. It was recorded. We've been presenting to the Board of Education. It's all out there. So this isn't necessarily the budget proposal itself, but these are the assumptions that we use to plug in to create the budget. So we know that we're in the second year of the biennium. We know what that revenue stream is going to be. Like I said, we had a 4% increase. Our growth target for enrollment is a conservative 3.5. Of course, if enrollment is higher than that, that's great. Property taxes cap out at 3.2%. We get that year over year throughout the year. We're looking at revamping our grants and contracts within the college to generate more grants to offset the general fund, to just get more activity with the faculty and staff. We also get a certain amount of overhead. So we're hoping that by the end of next year, that will be a refined process and grants will be on the upswing. For expenditures and requirements, so we know what our salaries are going to be. Classified staff just locked in a new bargaining agreement, which goes retroactive from this current year all the way through FY30. So we know what those step increases are going to be. We know what their health insurance is going to be. So that's been plugged in. Faculty rolled forward their contract one more year. So there's a set standard of increases and step increases that tell us what their salary amounts are going to be. And then management positions such as myself, we have a working document of how those increases with inflation and whatnot with those step increases will be across the board. Then I also talk about the 1.6 in vacant positions that we froze, and those will be released. Those have been budgeted also for us to fill those positions in FY25. So then non-salary elements are materials and supplies. That's always been the first place we go when we do budget cuts, because we don't want to cut staff, so we cut materials and supplies. So what we're trying to do this year is give a little bit more back to M&S, and we did that through a 3% increase, which is pretty small in the grand scheme of things, but it'll help programs be able to do what they need to do in a more efficient manner. We also have new strategic investments. Deferred maintenance has been put off. It's always one of the first places that institutions go when they need to do budget cuts. So now we're kind of at this critical level where we've presented to the board, hey, we have buildings and infrastructure that need to be addressed. So we've added in amounts for that. Same with IT investment. We're at a critical stage for replacing things like laptops. Printers and hardware across campus are ancient. We need to update those. Enrollment investment. So we work with outside consultants to help engage in our community to bring in new students, to make sure that students are aware of our services and what they can get from LCC. We also have Lane Forward, which is an internal initiative. It's innovative. It's basically like mini grants. So faculty, staff, and students create teams that come up with proposals on innovative and collaborative projects to improve LCC. And so they get mini funds, and we've seen a really strong support for that. It's given good results, so we're going to continue to fund that. I also talked a little bit about funds 8 and 9 and how they're basically little mini projects. Well, fund 9, while on a whole is good, some of our services that we support have had a deficit. We've fallen out of the practice of transferring out support from the general fund to these sub funds, basically. So we have a 5-year plan to reconcile with those sub funds, and you'll see that included in transfers out. And then also the reserve for revenue shortfall, because we're more confident in enrollments and we've set kind of a lower target, we've reduced the revenue shortfall reserve to 350,000 from 4 million this year. So big drop, but we know a little bit more about what's out there in the world. We feel a little bit more confident with the targets that we've set. So that is everything in a nutshell. Anybody have any questions about the planning elements, the last few slides? Make crystal clear. Everything made sense.
Hardly.
Well, I'm open for questions, and we'll have a little bit of time here to discuss and answer questions. And then I've included our contact information. Before I get to that point, though, I just want to talk about next steps. So we'll convene on May 1st as a group, where I'll formally give the budget proposal. You'll get an electronic version of the proposal about a week ahead of time. So about a week before we meet, you'll get an electronic version. And then when you come on May 1st, we'll have a printed bound version for you to mark up with pen, notepads, whatever you want to do, and just a formal, this is your trophy for volunteering, basically. So we have the first at 5 p.m. We'll vote in a committee chair, which is someone that you would like to help lead the conversation and be that voice box between yourselves and the Board of Education and so on. Then we also have May 8th, which is another formally set where we can continue discussion. Of course, we'll have public comments available at all of these scheduled meetings. May 15th, May 22nd are also scheduled. Boards, committee members do it at a different pace. We might do it in one, we might do it in two. We have to meet at least once to discuss it and go through it. So it's kind of at the pace that we set. So we will meet at least once, and then we have 3 more scheduled in May, every Wednesday evening after that. Following the 1st and the 15th is a standard board meeting. So at 6 p.m. we'll adjourn and then kick right off into a board meeting, which you're welcome to stay at. And they'll talk about all of our regular scheduled programming. And then the idea is to review, discuss, and then make a motion to vote in an official FY25 budget to move it into that adopted state, which the board will do at the standard meeting. Timing sound pretty good? Does that all make sense? Yeah, okay. So with that, here's a resources slide. These are all of our board policies, plus the Department of Revenue Oregon Budget Law training. Here's our contact information. Feel free to reach out. And with that, here's some fun pictures. And also, I am here for questions, discussion. So now it's your time. I'm here for you. Go ahead, jump right in.
So the budget meetings, are those evening meetings? Or are they?
They are. So they start at 5 p.m. and they're scheduled for an hour on the 1st and the 15th. And then because they're scheduled for an hour because we have the board meeting following the standard board meeting at 6 p.m. The other evenings on the 8th and the 22nd are, I think they're for an hour, but we have a little more flexibility because of we don't have a following board meeting. Ron, did you have any questions you wanted to throw out there? Well, I know this was a lot of information. Hopefully it was helpful. I'll send these slides out where I'm here to answer questions. I'm your guide. So don't hesitate to reach out, ask questions. We can't make official decisions and have official discussion until we're together as a group, but the foundation that I've set here is open for clarification if you need it. So feel free to reach out. I'm excited to meet with y'all and to go through the budget. I really appreciate your time because I have been looking at this thing for the last several months, and I'm very excited for someone else to look at it and to work with you all and get to know you. So